The Sanctuary of Silence. At the Obsidian, the air was thick with the scent of expensive truffle and the heavier weight of unspoken threats. Kang Jae-hwan sat at table 7, a man who ruled the city's concrete arteries without ever raising his voice. To the world, he was an enigma in navy wool, a man so powerful that his silence was more feared than a gunshot. Moving between the tables was Delma C. Smith. She was the perfect ghost. For years, she had mastered the art of the invisible server, moving through the world of predators by never making eye contact, never speaking out of turn, and never letting her hands shake. She had traded her identity for safety, living a life without a footprint. But invisibility is a fragile shield. When the glass doors of the lobby swung open, Delma didn't see a customer, she saw the end of her life. The man from her nightmares. The one who had left her for dead in a shallow grave years ago, walked in. The invisible woman didn't run for the exit. In a desperate gamble of instinct over logic, she collapsed at the feet of the most dangerous man in the room. Her hands, interlocked in a trembling prayer, gripped Jae-hwan's table. "He's coming back to kill me," she whispered, her voice a jagged blade in the quiet room. Jae-hwan didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even stand up. He simply looked down at the woman who had dared to break his silence, and with a single, calm hand, he steadied her shaking fingers. The Sanctuary of Silence wasn't broken, it was simply expanding to include her. The Obsidian was a symphony of controlled movements. Delma moved through the dining room like a ghost in silk and starch, her steps practiced, her presence a mere whisper against the backdrop of clinking crystal and the low hum of power players making deals. She prided herself on being invisible. To be noticed in a place like this was a failure of the craft, and Delma C. Smith had spent 3 years perfecting the art of disappearing. She was clearing a side table when the heavy, brass-rimmed doors of the lobby swung open. At first, it was just a silhouette against the streetlights of the city, a broad-shouldered man in a heavy coat. But as he stepped into the warm, amber glow of the foyer, the air seemed to vanish from Delma's lungs. It wasn't just a face, it was a scar on her soul. It was Elias. The silver tray in her hand suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. Time didn't just slow down, it curdled. She saw the way he tilted his head, that same predatory tilt he'd had 3 years ago when he'd looked at her across a rain-slicked alley and told her she wouldn't live to see the morning. He was older, his jawline heavier, but the eyes were unmistakable, cold, flat, and devoid of anything resembling a conscience. A violent tremor started in Delma's knees and raced upward. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such force she was certain the diners at the nearby tables could hear the frantic rhythm. The polished floor beneath her felt like it was tilting, turning into the mud of that shallow grave she had barely crawled out of. "He's here. He found me." The thought was a scream in her mind, though her lips remained frozen. Her vision began to tunnel, the edges of the room blurring into a hazy gold, leaving only the man in the lobby in sharp, terrifying focus. He was speaking to the maitre d', his eyes scanning the room with a casual, terrifying patience. He was hunting. Delma tried to take a step back, to retreat into the safety of the kitchen, but her legs had turned to lead. Her central nervous system was misfiring. The fine motor skills she used to carry delicate wine glasses vanished, replaced by a primitive, paralyzing dread. Her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches that burned her throat. She saw Elias's gaze begin to sweep toward her section. In seconds, the invisible waitress would be the only thing he saw. The physical rejection of her own body was total. A cold sweat broke across her brow, and her hands, usually so steady, began to shake so violently that the tray finally slipped. It didn't hit the floor with a crash, she caught the edge of a table to steady herself, her fingers digging into the expensive white linen. She wasn't looking at the exit anymore. She couldn't make it that far. Her eyes landed on the only fixed point in the room, the man who sat like a mountain of stone at table 7. Kang Jae-hwan. He was the only thing more dangerous than the ghost in the lobby. With her balance gone and her heart failing her, Delma didn't retreat. She let the gravity of her fear pull her toward the one man who didn't look like he knew how to be afraid. The distance between the service station and table 7 felt like a mile of open desert, but Delma covered it in a blur of stumbling steps. Her vision was narrowing into a dark pinhole, the golden light of the chandeliers turning into jagged shards of fire. Behind her, she could hear the rhythmic click of shoes on marble. Elias was moving. The predator had caught the scent of the prey. Her strength gave out just as she reached the edge of the white linen. Delma didn't just fall, she subsided, her knees striking the floor with a dull, sickening thud that sent a ripple through the crystal glassware on the table. Her hands, white-knuckled and slick with cold sweat, lunged forward to grip the edge of the tablecloth as if it were a life raft in a storm. She leaned into the personal space of the man seated there, a proximity that would usually result in immediate termination or worse. "He's in the lobby," she rasped, the words tearing out of her throat in a dry, desperate friction. She was so close to Kang Jae-hwan that she could smell the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and cedarwood clinging to his suit. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot with terror, searching his face for a flicker of humanity, a spark of alarm, anything. "He's coming back to kill me. Please." Jae-hwan did not move. He didn't flinch at the sudden intrusion. He didn't pull his silk-clad arm away from her trembling touch. He remained perfectly upright, a monument of dark navy wool and absolute composure. His gaze stayed fixed on the deep red swirl of the wine in his glass for a heartbeat too long, a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the air out of the room. Around them, the restaurant began to dim into a secondary reality. The murmurs of other diners died away as the tension at table 7 radiated outward like a shockwave. Slowly, with a deliberate grace that was more terrifying than a shout, Jae-hwan set his wine glass down. The stem clicked against the table with surgical precision. Only then did he turn his head. His eyes were not cold, they were empty, a vacuum that sucked in Delma's panic and offered nothing in return. He didn't look toward the lobby to verify her story. He didn't signal his bodyguards, though she could feel them closing in like shadows from the periphery. Instead, he reached out a hand. His fingers were steady, his skin warm, as he placed his palm firmly over her clasped, shaking hands, pinning them to the table. It was a gesture of total, crushing dominance that somehow felt like an anchor. "You are spilling my wine, Delma," he said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone, devoid of any urgency. It was the sound of a man who viewed a death threat as a mere lapse in decorum. "Please," she whispered again, her breath hitching. "He's right there." Jae-hwan finally shifted his gaze to the foyer, his eyes narrowing just a fraction as he spotted the man who had dared to disturb the sanctity of his meal. He didn't stand up. He didn't even tense his shoulders. He simply leaned back, his hand still heavy and grounding over hers. "Then let him come," he murmured, his voice chillingly calm. "I find I have a sudden appetite for a different kind of entertainment." The stillness at table 7 became a physical weight, a localized gravity that seemed to pull the very air out of the surrounding room. Delma remained on her knees, her breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts, her entire existence tethered to the table by Jae-hwan's heavy, unmoving hand. She wanted to bolt, to hide in the shadows of the kitchen, but the pressure on her knuckles was an unspoken command, "Stay." In the periphery, the machinery of Jae-hwan's world began to grind into gear. Two men in charcoal suits, positioned at the nearby pillars, shifted their weight. Their hands moved toward the inner linings of their jackets, their eyes fixed on the man approaching from the lobby with predatory intent. The air grew electric with the impending violence. "Boss," one of the guards murmured, his voice a low vibration of readiness. He stepped forward, a silent question in his eyes, waiting for the signal to intercept the intruder. Jae-hwan didn't look at him. He didn't even lift his chin. "Stand down," he said. The command was quiet, but it carried the absolute finality of a gavel. "But he's armed," the guard persisted, his voice tight. "I said," Jae-hwan repeated, finally turning his head just enough to catch the guard's gaze with a look of icy indifference. "Stand down. No one moves. No one speaks. You are blocking the light." The guards froze, retreating back into the shadows like obedient hounds. It was a terrifying display of ego and control. To Jae-hwan, the threat of a hitman was secondary to the maintenance of his own atmosphere. He was not protecting Delma out of gallantry, he was claiming her as part of his sovereign territory. Delma looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching. She could see the silhouette of Elias getting closer, the shadow of her past stretching across the expensive carpet toward her. "He'll kill us both," she hissed, her voice trembling with the certainty of a woman who had already died once. Jae-hwan's grip on her hands tightened, not enough to hurt, but enough to remind her who owned the silence in this room. He finally looked down at her, his expression unreadable, almost bored. "He cannot kill what I have not given him permission to touch," he whispered. "Look at me, Delma. Not at the door. At me." She forced her gaze away from the approaching death and into the dark, bottomless pools of Jae-hwan's eyes. He sat perfectly relaxed, his other hand reaching for a piece of artisan bread, breaking it with a methodical, terrifying calm. He was forcing her to be a statue in his garden of stone. The sound of Elias's boots was loud now. Heavy, arrogant thuds that ignored the elegance of the obsidian. He was 20 feet away, then 15. Delma's heart felt like it was going to burst through her ribs, but Jae-hwan's hand remained a leaden weight, pinning her fear to the floor. He sat there, a king who refused to rise for a common executioner, asserting his dominance not through a show of force, but through a total, chilling refusal to acknowledge that anyone else in the world mattered. The heavy, rhythmic thud of leather soles against the marble finally stopped. The air at table 7 grew cold, as if the intruder had brought the winter of the streets inside with him. Delma didn't need to turn around to know that Elias was standing directly behind her. She could feel the heat of his malice radiating off his coat, a familiar, suffocating pressure that had haunted her dreams for 3 years. "I spent a lot of time looking for you, Delma," a voice rasped. It was a jagged sound, out of place among the soft clink of silver and the muted jazz playing in the rafters. "You always were a good little mouse. But even mice have to come out for crumbs eventually." Delma flinched, her forehead almost touching the edge of the table. She waited for the sound of a hammer cocking or the sudden, sharp sting of a blade. Instead, there was only a heavy, expectant silence. Jae-hwan finally looked up. He didn't look at Elias with fear, or even with the professional curiosity of one killer observing another. He looked at him with the mild annoyance of a man finding a fly in a very expensive soup. His hand remained over Delma's, a heavy anchor keeping her from drifting into the abyss of her own terror. "You are standing in my light," Jae-hwan said. His voice was smooth, a sharp contrast to Elias's gravelly tone. "And you are speaking to my staff." Both are considered grave insults at table 7. Elias let out a low, mocking huff of a laugh. He stepped sideways, coming into Delma's peripheral vision. He was leaning over slightly, one hand buried in his coat pocket, a pocket that hung heavy with the unmistakable weight of steel. "I don't know who you are, pal, and I don't care. The girl belongs to me. She's got a debt that can only be paid in one currency. Step aside, and maybe I'll let you finish your meal." The standoff was a perfect, frozen triangle. Delma was at the base, paralyzed on her knees, Elias stood as the encroaching shadow, his hand twitching in his pocket, and Jae-hwan sat at the apex, the calm center of a turning world. The Mafia boss didn't move his hand from Delma's. In fact, he leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between himself and the barrel of the hidden gun. "You speak of debts," Jae-hwan murmured, his eyes narrowing until they were mere slits of dark obsidian. "But you have walked into my house, uninvited, and threatened a woman under my hand. In my world, that is a debt that bankrupts a man." Elias's smirk flickered. He looked around the room, finally noticing the way the other diners had vanished into the shadows and how the waiters at the perimeter were standing with a lethal, coiled stillness. The realization began to dawn on him that he hadn't walked into a restaurant, he had walked into a cage. "You think you're someone special?" Elias spat, though the bravado in his voice was beginning to fray at the edges. "I am the man who is going to decide if you breathe another minute," Jae-hwan replied. He finally let go of Delma's hand, but only to pick up his steak knife. He turned the blade in the light, the polished steel catching the glow of the chandelier. "And right now, I am leaning toward silence." The tension in the air didn't just break, it transformed. As Jae-hwan studied the man standing over his table, the mild annoyance in his eyes hardened into something ancient and crystalline. He didn't just see a common hitman or a ghost from a waitress's past. He saw a signature. He saw a style of violence he had buried a decade ago. "Elias Thorne," Jae-hwan said, the name sliding off his tongue like a slow-acting poison. "I heard you were scavenging in the southern territories. I didn't realize you had been reduced to hunting girls in my dining room." Elias stiffened, his hand jerking convulsively inside his coat pocket. The mocking smirk he had worn moments ago vanished, replaced by a pale, sickly realization. He took a half-step back, his boots scuffing the marble. "Kong," he whispered, the name coming out as a wheeze. "I didn't know this was your place. I didn't know the girl was yours." "She isn't," Jae-hwan replied, his voice terrifyingly conversational. "But she is here. And you are here. Which means we have a discrepancy in our previous arrangement." Delma looked between the two men, her breath hitching. The terror of her past was colliding with the cold reality of her present. She realized then that she wasn't just a victim caught in a crossfire, she was the catalyst for a much larger reckoning. The man who had tried to kill her 3 years ago wasn't just a random shadow, he was a piece of Jae-hwan's unfinished business. That night at the docks 10 years ago, Jae-hwan continued, his gaze never leaving Elias's sweating face. "You were supposed to disappear. I paid for your exile in blood and gold. Coming back to this city is a breach of contract. Coming to my table to finish a job I didn't authorize. That is an act of war." "She saw things, Kong." Elias snarled, desperation finally overriding his fear. "She was a witness to the shipment. My employers." "Your employers are irrelevant," Jae-hwan interrupted, his voice dropping to a register that made the wine in the glasses vibrate. "By stepping into the obsidian, you have moved this from a personal vendetta to a corporate liquidation. Delma's life is no longer a debt you are owed. It is a property I have just acquired." Jae-hwan reached out and poured a fresh splash of red wine into his glass, the sound of the liquid hitting the crystal the only noise in the suffocating silence. He looked down at Delma, who was still trembling at his feet. For the first time, his gaze held something other than indifference, it was a dark, possessive interest. "It seems, Delma," he murmured, "that your ghost and my past are the same man. This is no longer a plea for mercy. This is a business matter. And I am very, very good at business." He looked back at Elias, his expression settling into the mask of a man who had already moved the final chess piece. "You have 30 seconds to convince me why I shouldn't have my men strip the skin from your bones right here on the carpet." The 30 seconds did not pass in words, they passed in the agonizing sound of Delma's own frantic heartbeat. Jae-hwan did not look at the clock. He did not look at the guards. He simply waited, his fingers playing idly with the stem of his glass, while Elias's face transitioned from a mask of aggression to one of frantic, cornered desperation. The killer's hand stayed buried in his pocket, but the barrel of the gun was trembling now, a visible shudder against the fabric of his coat. "Get up," Jae-hwan said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command that bypassed Delma's paralyzed nerves and spoke directly to her survival instinct. When she didn't move immediately, his hand shifted from the table to her elbow. His grip was like a band of iron, cold and absolute. He pulled, and Delma found herself rising, her legs feeling like hollow glass. He didn't pull her behind him. He pulled her to his side, forcing her to stand flush against the dark navy wool of his shoulder. "Look at him, Delma," Jae-hwan whispered into her ear, his breath a chillingly calm contrast to the heat of her panic. "He is the architect of your nightmares. See how small he is when the lights are on." Delma shook her head, her eyes blurred with tears of pure reflex. "I can't," she choked out. "You will," Jae-hwan countered. He shifted his weight, subtly positioning his body so that he was a literal wall between her and the direct line of Elias's pocket, yet he kept her visible. He was using her as a lure, a living provocation. He is a ghost, and ghosts only have power in the dark. Look at him and realize he is just a man waiting for my permission to die. Delma forced her chin up. Her gaze collided with Elias's. In the harsh, cinematic light of the restaurant, the man who had haunted her for 3 years looked different. He looked sweaty. He looked panicked. The monster was a scavenger who had wandered into a lion's den, and the lion was currently using her as a shield. Elias's eyes darted between them, the predatory glint replaced by the frantic calculations of a losing gambler. "You're crazy, Kong," he rasped, his voice cracking. "You're going to die for a waitress. She's nothing. She's a ghost." "She was a ghost," Jae-hwan corrected, his voice rising just enough to fill the hollow silence of the room. "Now, she is my guest. And you are a trespasser." Jae-hwan let go of her arm, but he didn't move away. He stood so close she could feel the steady, rhythmic thrum of his pulse. He was giving Elias an opening, a clear shot if the man was fast enough. It was a trap built of pure arrogance. Jae-hwan was betting his life and hers on the fact that Elias was too terrified of the consequences to pull the trigger. "Draw your weapon, Elias," Jae-hwan challenged, his hands resting casually on the edge of the table, nowhere near a gun of his own. "Show her how brave you are when you aren't hunting in the rain." The silence in the obsidian grew so thin it felt as though the air itself might shatter. Elias's eyes were blown wide, the pupils swallowing the irises as he stared at the impossible target Jae-hwan had presented. He looked at Delma, then at the man who shielded her with nothing but a tailored suit and a terrifying lack of fear. The pressure of the moment, the weight of Jae-hwan's men in the shadows and the icy certainty of his own doom, finally snapped the last thread of Elias's control. "Damn you!" Elias screamed. The movement was a blur of frantic motion. Elias yanked his hand from his pocket, the heavy black steel of a compact pistol catching the golden light of the chandelier. Delma's instinct was to scream, to squeeze her eyes shut and wait for the thunder that would end her life. But Jae-hwan was faster. He didn't reach for a gun, he reached for the world as if it were a precision instrument. Before Elias could level the barrel, Jae-hwan's hand lashed out with the speed of a striking viper. He didn't grab the gun. He grabbed Elias's wrist, his thumb driving into a nerve cluster with enough force to make the killer's fingers lose their grip. The sound of metal on marble followed, a sharp, ringing clatter as the pistol hit the floor and spun toward a corner. In the same fluid motion, Jae-hwan stepped into Elias's space, his shoulder driving into the man's chest to off-balance him. With his left hand, Jae-hwan picked up the heavy steak knife he had been turning earlier. There was no struggle, no frantic grappling. It was a surgical execution of movement. The blade didn't flash in a wide arc, it moved in a short, straight line. A muffled, wet sound echoed through the silent dining room. Delma gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Jae-hwan stood perfectly still, his face inches from Elias's. The knife was buried to the hilt in the table, pinned through the meat of Elias's palm, anchoring the killer's hand to the very linen Delma had been clutching moments ago. Elias didn't scream, the shock was too total. He simply sagged, his legs turning to water as he stared down at his hand, pinned to table 7 like a specimen in a lab. Blood began to bloom across the white tablecloth, a dark, spreading map of Jae-hwan's victory. Jae-hwan didn't let go of the knife's handle. He leaned in closer, his voice a silk-wrapped blade. I told you that you were ruining my dinner, Elias. This is the bill. He didn't look at the blood. He didn't look at the man sobbing in agony. He turned his head slightly toward Delma, his expression as calm and unruffled as if he had just cleared a smudge from his wine glass. He looked at her trembling form, his eyes searching hers. For the moment the fear turned into something else. The sound of metal hitting the floor, Jaehwan whispered to her, is the sound of your past losing its teeth. Do you see now? He is just meat and bone. He let go of the knife then, stepping back and smoothing the front of his dark navy jacket. He didn't have a single drop of blood on his sleeves. He looked at his guards, who were already moving in to clean the mess. Take him to the basement, Jaehwan commanded. I want to see how much of my gold he still has in his pockets. The transition was seamless, a testament to the terrifying efficiency of Jaehwan's world. Within moments, the heavy thud of the guards' footsteps faded as they dragged a semi-conscious Elias toward the service elevators. The bloody steak knife was gone. The ruined tablecloth was whisked away by two silent busboys who moved with the hollow precision of clockwork, replacing it with fresh, bone-white linen before the air had even cleared of the scent of iron. The other diners, those who had frozen in the face of the violence, were ushered out with hushed apologies and the promise of a night on the house. The obsidian was being scrubbed of its sins in real time. Soon, the only people left in the vast, vaulted dining room were the shadows in the corners and the two figures at table 7. Delma stood rooted to the spot, her hands still pressed against her lips. Her knees were locked, trembling so violently she feared they might snap. The ghost was gone, but the man who had exorcised him remained. She looked down at her uniform. A splash of Elias's blood had caught the hem of her white shirt, a crimson reminder that this wasn't a nightmare she could wake up from. Jaehwan seated himself once more. He adjusted the set of his shoulders and picked up a clean linen napkin, snapping it open with a sound like a pistol shot. He didn't look like a man who had just pinned a human hand to a table. He looked like a man waiting for his dessert. Sit, he said. It wasn't a request. Delma's legs gave way, and she dropped into the velvet chair opposite him. Her mind was a chaotic storm of conflicting impulses. She should be running. She should be thanking him. She should be terrified of the way he looked at her now, not as a waitress, but as a curiosity. You saved me, she whispered, her voice sounding small and brittle in the cavernous room. I protected my interests, Jaehwan corrected. He poured the remainder of the wine into his glass, the liquid a dark, mocking echo of the blood that had just stained the table. There is a difference. Elias Thorne was a debt I had yet to collect. You were simply the collateral that brought him to my door. Delma looked at his hands, the same hands that had held hers with such grounding weight, the same hands that had moved with lethal, surgical speed. There was no tremor in them. No regret. What happens to me now? She asked. The fear was different now. It wasn't the jagged, hot panic of being hunted by Elias. It was the cold, heavy realization that she had traded a predator she knew for a god she didn't understand. I can't stay here. I'm a witness now. I'm part of, whatever this is. Jaehwan set the bottle down and finally looked at her. For the first time, his unreadable mask shifted, a predatory glint appearing in the depths of his dark eyes. You were a witness the moment you chose to fall at my feet, Delma. You walked out of the shadows and into the light. There is no going back to being invisible. He leaned forward, the warm light of the chandelier casting long, sharp shadows across his face. You wanted to live. I have given you that. Now, you must decide what that life is worth. The silence of the empty restaurant was absolute, a heavy velvet shroud that muffled the city outside. Delma looked at her hands, still pale and trembling against the fresh, pristine white of the tablecloth. She realized then that the woman who had walked into her shift that afternoon, the woman who believed she could hide forever in the margins of other people's lives, was dead. Elias hadn't killed her, but Jaehwan had. Jae-hwan took a slow, methodical sip of his wine, watching her over the rim of the glass with the patient detachment of a king observing a new addition to his court. The world is divided into two types of people, Delma, he said, his voice a low, resonance vibration in the stillness. There are those who are acted upon, and those who act. For 3 years, you have been the former. You have been a ghost waiting for a grave. Tonight, you broke that cycle when you reached for my table. He set the glass down and leaned back, his silhouette sharp against the warm glow of the room. Now, the door is open. If you wish, you may walk out of it. I will give you enough money to disappear, truly this time. You can find another city, another uniform, and spend the rest of your nights jumping at shadows, wondering if the next face you see in a lobby will be the one that finishes what Elias started. Delma felt the cold draft from the foyer, the lure of that nobody life she had clung to for so long. It was the life of a mouse, always listening for the snap of the trap. Or, Jae-hwan continued, his voice dropping to a register of dark, enticing gravity, you can stay. You can trade your invisibility for a shadow that no one dares to cross. You will no longer be a waitress at the Obsidian. You will be a ward of Table 7. Under my wings, you will be untouchable. But you will also be mine. Your eyes will see what I see, your ears will hear the secrets this city keeps in the dark. You will never be at nobody again. Delma looked at the spot on the floor where the gun had fallen, then back at the man who had caught it with his bare hands. The fear was still there, coiled in the pit of her stomach, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the fear of a victim, it was the intoxicating, terrifying weight of power. She looked at her reflection in the polished silverware, the smooth low bun, the professional vest, and saw a shell that no longer fit. If I stay, she whispered, her voice finding a sudden, unexpected edge of steel, what is the price? A slow, rare smile touched Jae-hwan's lips, a predatory, fleeting movement that didn't reach his obsidian eyes. The price is your silence, Delma. And your absolute loyalty. In exchange, I will give you a world where you never have to tremble again. He reached out his hand, palm up, across the table. It was the same hand that had pinned her panic to the linen, the same hand that had spilled blood to keep her safe. Delma looked at the open palm, then at the dark navy wool of his sleeve. She realized that the Obsidian wasn't just a restaurant. It was a mirror. She didn't hesitate. She reached out and placed her hand in his, her fingers disappearing into his strong, steady grip. I'm tired of running, she said. Jae-hwan closed his fingers around hers, a final, binding seal. Good, he murmured, rising from the table and pulling her up with him. Then let us go. We have work to do, and the night is still young. As they walked toward the exit, the lights of the Obsidian dimmed one by one, leaving the room to the shadows. Delma didn't look back at the lobby. She kept her eyes on the back of the man in the navy suit, stepping into the dark at his side, no longer a ghost, but a queen in the making.